Donald Trump has a new supporter, and it is none other than the co-founder of Craft Ventures and the co-host of the All In podcast, David Sachs, who you've seen on our show several times and whom we are thrilled to have back today. David, welcome back to the show.
Good to see you, Danny. Yeah.
And listen, I just want to jump right into this because this is I guess it took some people by surprise because you certainly are engaged in things besides just your venture capital and the things that you do with your day job, so to speak. But this one seemed to be kind of set a difference into why you chose to formally endorse Trump and then to actually hold a fundraiser for him. So we're going to talk about some of the things that you have said and why you did some of that. But I wonder, first of all, if you could just kind of explain what led you to make this decision in the first place that's maybe different than other things you've done.
Well, Danny, I've done a number of events for political candidates. I did fundraisers for Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and several Democratic and Republican candidates for Congress. So I've done that over the past several years. That's what we did here is we did a fundraiser for Trump on June 6th. I guess it was Thursday last week, D-Day. And I decided that before the event, I would do something I hadn't done in those other cases, which is explain my reasons for supporting Trump. And so I posted an endorsement on X that you saw, and I identified four main issues that caused me to support Trump. One is the economy and specifically inflation. Biden's reckless spending, I think, have caused this inflation problem, which has really hamstrung the economy. And worse, he seems to have no understanding of the problem because he's suggesting in his 2025 budget that he wants even more spending. The second was foreign policy in the Ukraine war. I think Biden presents an unacceptable risk of the Ukraine war continuing to escalate, potentially into World War III. And I know you have similar concerns, so we should definitely talk about that. The third issue was the border, where Biden, for the first 3 years of his presidency, gaslit us and said there was no problem there, even though videos kept coming out of masses of people streaming across the border. Then more recently, he's finally admitted that he has the authority to do something about it. He signed an executive order, but it's simply too little, too late. And I just don't think he has credibility on the issue. And I think that if Biden wins a second term, we can expect a resumption of the open border policy of his first term. And then the fourth issue was lawfare. I'm just really turned off by Biden's insistence to prosecute his political opponents. I mean, really, ever since the moment Biden took office, he has sought to prosecute Trump. And you saw this. There were press reports very early on in the Biden administration where Merrick Garland took a close look at the whole January 6th situation and decided that there was nothing to prosecute there, that they could not make charges work. Nonetheless, there were press stories started appearing that of Biden admonishing Garland's reticence. And the result is that we got all these prosecutors popping up. We had Jack Smith at the federal level and then Alvin Bragg and Fani Willis at the state level. And they are literally trying to put Trump in jail. And I just think that is profoundly un-American to seek to jail your political opponents. That type of political repression is why my parents came to America when I was a young boy. And so I think, like many Americans, I'm just really turned off by that. And that really, I think, put me over the edge in terms of wanting to endorse Trump now.
I think, David, the issue that pops to me the most in the whole lawfare category is the fact that one of the remaining trials that Trump still has to navigate is the issue of the classified documents in his house. And then you had the issue of the classified documents in Biden's house. And then the investigators who checked it out said that, yeah, it was illegal, but that they just chose not to prosecute for some pretty thin reasons to me. And just as someone who's just looking at it from a independent network, I mean, I'm thinking if you're both have done the same thing, those photographs are nearly the same, and the boxes that are in each of their houses, and yet one's being on trial and one is just being not even given a slap on the wrist, just like, yeah, just pass and go through. That's one of the things that really stood out to me that seems to be a problem.
The hypocrisy is egregious. I mean, it's a total double standard. I mean, you are basically prosecuting your chief political opponent for something you yourself have done. I mean, they did find all those documents in the garage with the Corvette. I mean, documents that, by the way, went all the way back to his time in the Senate, as well as vice president. Moreover, he never had presidential authority to declassify those documents the way that Trump did. So, he's on even, I'd say, shakier ground than Trump was. So to prosecute your opponent for something you yourself had done, I just think is completely hypocritical. Look, I personally think that these documents cases are overblown in general. The government overclassifies everything, and it's probably somewhat easy for a politician to make this mistake, given that everything is classified, even their daily news clippings from the New York Times. So I think probably the right thing to do here is not to prosecute these cases, but certainly a double standard in the prosecution just seems really egregious and wrong.
Well, and plus, I can just tell you that if you're not a president, I mean, they're going to slap if you get caught with classified information out somewhere, as someone who dealt with a lot of classified while I was on active duty, I can promise you, if somebody took classified, I saw plenty of people that were convicted and had all kinds of stuff happen to them. And some of it wasn't on actually all the ones I saw. None of them were on purpose, but they still got in trouble for mishandling classified information. And yet, anyway, I don't need to, I guess, repeat on that.
Well, there have been some cases in the past, but I mean, there was one notable one where Sandy Berger, who I guess was a national security advisor for Clinton, he was stuffing his pants with documents in a skiff and then walking out with them. That was never really explained. No one really knows what he was up to, but he kind of got away with a slap on the wrist. And then Petraeus had a documents issue, and in any event, they're punishing, or they're seeking to prosecute Trump in a way that they never did for these other people, and certainly not for Biden himself. So there's absolutely a double standard there.
Absolutely, there is, and that's something that I think concerns a lot of Americans in regards to their political background. I want to jump on the issue of your foreign policy part, which you had mentioned a second ago, Gary. If you can throw that portion of his tweet back up here when he's explaining. You talk about many things in this section here, but I wanted to highlight this one in the blue area here, where you said, but Biden's biggest blunder has so far been in Ukraine. His administration immediately began pushing for Ukraine's admission to NATO, despite no unanimity among the existing NATO members that such a move was a good idea. When this predictably antagonized the Russians, the Biden administration doubled down at every turn, insisting that NATO's door is open and will remain open, end quote, with respect to Ukraine. Biden himself baited Russia when he said he didn't accept anybody's red line. Now, that's kind of playing into some current issues here, where Biden has now, number one, he has methodically over the last 2 years bypassed every so-called red line. But this latest one, now he's like saying has authorized U.S. weapons to be fired into Russia. And I'm going to show you some of that in just a minute. But what was on your mind in that part that you included that in your tweet?
Well, I think this was a very easily avoidable war. Biden was put on notice by Putin directly, I think, when they did that summit in Geneva, and was it June or July of 2021, that bringing Ukraine into NATO was an unacceptable red line for the Russians. Of course, Biden should have known that going all the way back to his time as vice president. As Professor Mearsheimer and yourself have been pointing out, I mean, the Russians have been hollering about this since 2008 in the Bucharest Declaration. Biden surely knew that, but Putin told him directly in their summit in that summer of 2021. And he could have quietly settled this issue then and there. But instead, what did he do? He brought Zelensky to the White House. I think it was on September 1st of 2021 for a big photo op. And then on November 10th, they issued a 10-year charter agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine, where the U.S. not only gave economic help, but said that it would give extensive military support, and it reiterated that it would be bringing Ukraine into NATO. And that's when Lavrov said that the issue had reached the boiling point. And in mid-December, the Russians sent that draft treaty and basically said that either we can negotiate a peaceful solution to this, where you take NATO expansion off the table, or there are going to be military repercussions. And that's when Blinken said that NATO's door is open and will remain open. I mean, they basically just poked their finger in the eye of the Russians and completely ignored their concerns. And then a month later, this war began. So, look, I just think that if Biden and his administration had taken seriously the Russian red line around NATO expansion, then I don't think this war would have happened. It was
Well,
easily
look,
avoidable through
David,
diplomacy.
I'll just tell you that I actually had lunch with a senior diplomat from one of America's longest friends and allies. I won't say which one because he didn't authorize me to say anything publicly, but he told me point blank last month in Washington that at that June 2021 summit that Putin point blank said, if you keep going on with this nonsense of NATO and Ukraine, there's going to be war. We will use force to it. And Biden reportedly said, hey, do whatever you think you can. But you're smaller. We can crush you economically. And if you think you can do it, then go ahead. Basically baiting him to do it. So it's even worse than it appears.
Yeah. I mean, Biden said publicly, I don't accept anyone's red lines. He actually said that. I just think that is diplomatic negligence. Like, why wouldn't you pay attention to that? I mean, clearly they welcomed this opportunity to weaken and humiliate the Russians, and of course, it's backfired horribly on them.
Right. Yeah. And of course, you know, Austin infamously said almost verbatim what you just did earlier in the war, that was a stated objective of ours. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be much of any kind of an actual objective or a strategy behind what we're doing other than, hey, if it hurts Russia, cool, I guess keep going, but with no idea of where this is going or what even success looks like. That's one of my bigger problems.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think there is a strategy here. I mean, originally, I guess the strategy was to try and evict the Russians from Ukrainian territory. But since the summer counteroffensive failed last year, it's very clear that's not going to happen. So now the strategy just seems to be to use the Ukrainians as a proxy to the last man to weaken Russia. But it's not weakening Russia. It's forcing Russia to put its economy on a war footing, to straighten out whatever problems it had in its military, to massively ramp up its military industrial production. And as a result of all of this, the Russian army is much stronger than it was when Biden took office. Their military is substantially larger. That's not just a result of conscription. It's a result of lots of patriotic Russians rallying around the flag and volunteering for service. It's also the case that Russia is now producing vastly more artillery shells, tanks, drones, planes, you name it. They have massively ramped up their military production, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. It's also driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. It's really, I think, caused Putin to catalyze a global movement against U.S. leadership. And it was none other than Russia hawk Fiona Hill, who said that, this was like pretty early in the war. She basically said that rather than bolstering U.S. leadership, it has provided a point around which the whole global South can rally around. And so essentially the global South is using Russia as a proxy against the U.S. at the same time that the U.S. is using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. So it has not bolstered American leadership. It's just been a disaster across the board.
Right. Then you can add in the advancement of BRICS, which apparently has continued to try to undermine the Western economic dominance, et cetera. You can add in North Korea providing weapons directly for Russia, Iran. I mean, the thing just keeps going on. Every time you look at it, the catalog just gets worse and worse and worse. Not to mention the destruction for the Ukrainian people of their territory and their people. So every way you look at it, it's just not going good for our side.
There's just no strategic benefit to this whatsoever.
In fact, it's the opposite, that there's a tremendous strategic loss and catastrophic loss for the Ukrainian side, whom we claim to actually want to help. One of the other things that I know that I've seen that you've written before, and I can't recall if it was in that tweet, but I know that it's something that you have said a lot in public, is the issue of why we have to, quote, stop Russia here, because if we don't, they're going to go further. That was reinforced just a couple of days ago by Volodymyr Zelensky himself, who emphasized saying this.
Методика нічим не відрізняється від гітлерівської політики у Путіна. Як вони масові страти робили, поховання, гвалтування нічим не відрізняється. І, вибачте, навіть маршрути окупації України, шляхи окупації України ті самі, що використовувала фашистська Німеччина. Але, тим не менш, вся Європа була повністю окупована. Суспільство само розуміло, що Гітлер, він не зупиниться. Він не зупиниться. Він піде далі. Він буде страчувати сім'ї. І він буде вбивати Британію всю.
So one of his favorite plans is to just demonize Putin to the point that he has become synonymous with Hitler. He's the same guy as Hitler, and he's going to come for everybody, apparently to destroy all the way to Great Britain. I missed that part of the plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think Professor Mearsheimer's explained abundantly why this Putler narrative is false. I mean, the Russians have all the territory they need. I mean, they are the largest country by landmass in the world, and the last thing they need is to try and subjugate peoples who hate them. They don't want to return to the situation that they had during the Cold War, where they were constantly putting down uprisings by basically subject peoples. And they didn't even want to conquer all of Ukraine. They were basically pushed into this by the fact that we were trying to use Ukraine as we were trying to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on their border. And moreover, they were pushed into it by the need to defend the Russian-speaking peoples of Eastern Ukraine from attacks by this sort of ultra-right nationalists who from the West, basically the fascists. And if we had simply worked out a deal for Ukrainian neutrality and respected the Minsk Accords, then none of this would have happened.
And instead, yeah, we've just gone the exact opposite. And then I suspect that once Zelensky went all in, and didn't run away. And partially this is, I say, to his credit, when this war first broke out, and apparently the United States was saying, hey, here's your card to exit the country and we'll help you out somewhere else. He's like, say, no, I don't need an exit. I need bullets, to continue to fight. Once he went all in on that, now then he can't backtrack. So even though, and I think you've mentioned this also before, in the first few weeks of the war, he was actually saying, okay, maybe we can negotiate. Maybe I can consider neutrality, etc. Right before everything just exploded in Istanbul. But once he did that, I just think that now he has to keep this fiction up that he's talking about here.
Right, exactly. Well, this was the next big Biden administration blunder after failing to take one of those diplomatic off-ramps in 2021, is that we had the Istanbul deal. And it was really clear that the war would stop and the Russians would retreat back to the pre-invasion borders if Ukraine would agree to neutrality. And they had a draft agreement. And one of Zelensky's advisors, Arestovich, was saying that they were actually popping champagne bottles, celebrating that they had worked out a peace deal, because this was before all of or I'd say the vast majority of all the death and destruction that's occurred in that country. But of course, that wasn't good enough for the West. It was the West that through Boris Johnson, and I'm sure Zelensky was hearing from other channels as well, that we don't want to make a peace deal with Putin. We want to pressure Putin. And they convinced Zelensky that the West could give him all the weapons he needed to defeat Russia. And Zelensky took that gamble. And this was reported in Ukrainian Pravda, which is a pro-Ukraine publication, I think roughly in May of 2022. And the way they reported it was that this was a brilliant gamble by Zelensky, because at that point in time, it looked like the Ukrainians were doing well on the battlefield. And so the reason they reported this is because it looked like Zelensky's decision to take Boris Johnson up on his offer was looking like a really good decision. That's why this came out. But of course, now we know that it was a disastrous gamble. The gamble has completely failed. And so there's been an attempt to memory hole what Boris Johnson said to him right after the Istanbul. But remember, this originally came from a Ukrainian publication.
Right. And, it related to that. I want to go back in time a little bit to 2022, when you wrote a piece for Newsweek which really, in my view, is kind of looking pretty prescient. And in fact, this article here could have been released like last week, and it would have been really current based on the things that are happening right now. I'm going to talk about a few things you wrote in there. Number one, you were talking about how we're basically kind of confusing things, and we want to just change all kinds of irrational things and link them together to make it sound like, Russia's once really strong and another that they're not, so that we can keep going. And specifically what you wrote was, warping the debate this way allows delusional and contradictory thinking to go unchallenged. Thus, we get an argument that Putin is a madman who will kill indiscriminately to achieve his aims, but he is somehow also definitely bluffing about using nuclear weapons. And he's only using that bluff because he's losing the war. But if he's not stopped in Ukraine, he will go on to conquer the rest of Europe. I mean, they're back to the Hitler thing there again. And those things are simultaneously existing, but somehow the supporters of this, whether it's Biden or many of the others like Lindsey Graham, don't seem concerned by the contradictions.
Yeah, I wrote that article in, I guess it was around September of 2022, and it was right after Elon Musk had posted his poll on Twitter X, suggesting a peace deal and letting people vote on it. And the peace deal actually turned out to be very similar to what we now know was contemplated at Istanbul. It was basically Russians would retreat to the pre-invasion borders, and the Ukrainians would agree to neutrality. The Russians would effectively keep Crimea, and then the water supply to Crimea would be assured. It was basically that type of a deal. And then there'd be a plebiscite or some sort of election with respect to the Donbass to figure out what to do there. I think that was basically the deal. They'd have some sort of autonomy that was promised them under the Minsk Accords. In any event, there was a huge backlash to this, and it was none other than Zelensky himself who posted in response to Elon that this deal was pro-Russian. So you could see in this example that merely speaking up for peace and proposing a reasonable deal that, frankly, the Ukrainians could never get now, that was considered a pro-Russian. And this was, in fact, the entire terms of debate that were set in 2022, is that if you were in favor of peace, that means that could only benefit Russia, that you were basically a Putin puppet. And the only acceptable position was to be in favor of maximalist Ukrainian demands, basically kicking the Russians not just out of eastern Ukraine, but also Crimea. I mean, that was basically what they were insisting on. And if you didn't accept every jot and tittle of their agenda, then that made you essentially a Putin puppet. And this is how the discourse was basically set up in 2022. So we never had an honest debate in the mainstream media about how this war started, about what the Russians' objectives really were, about how we could avoid this conflict. And as a result, it's kept escalating. If every suggestion for peace or negotiation is just dismissed as essentially being pro-Russian treason, then that only leaves you with the voices who are arguing for escalation. And that's exactly where we've ended up.
That's exactly right. And that leads to, so part of your title there was, or we risk World War III. And that's why I say that it's very relevant to today, because on June 6th, you had Vladimir Putin, who has continued to be pushed in these different directions. It's making clear that there is an endpoint if things go in the bad direction for him.
Американцы – единственная страна, Соединенные Штаты, которая использовала ядерное оружие во Второй мировой войне. Хиросима, Нагасаки – 20 килотонн. Наше тактическое ядерное оружие – 70-75 килотонн. Это такое ядерное тактическое оружие. Давайте не доводить не только до использования, а даже до угрозы использования. На Западе считают, что Россия никогда этого не использует. У нас же есть ядерная доктрина. Посмотрите, что написано. Если чьи-то действия будут угрожать нашему суверенитету и территориальной целостности, Мы считаем для себя возможным использовать все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Ну, нельзя относиться к этому легко, поверхностно. Нужно относиться профессионально.
Now, I've talked to quite a number of very experienced professionals, both internationally and militarily, and I've asked them, is this just Putin bluffing? Because you have such stalwarts as General Ben Hodges, who says, this is 0% chance. He doesn't mean any of that, et cetera. So ignore him. To other people, much more eminent, who have said he absolutely believes this, and if only known to him, if that line gets pushed somewhere beyond his willingness to contemplate it, he will use nuclear weapons. He will use tactical nuclear weapons. Is that what you had in mind when you're talking about the risk of World War III?
Absolutely. I mean, you hear the contradictory argument by these people that on the one hand, Putin is a total madman who will kill anyone who stands in the way of achieving his objectives. And then on the other hand, that we should just ignore all of his warnings about nuclear use as bluffs.
Man,
Look, what I hear when I listen to that video is I hear someone speaking softly and carrying a big stick. I mean, he is definitely he's definitely intimating about that they have this big stick, but at the same time, he's not yelling like a madman or anything like that.
right.
I don't think he wants to be pushed into this position, basically, but it would be possible, it sounds like, to push him into that position.
Right. And yeah, and he elsewhere said also in just the last couple of days that he doesn't want to do this, that he thinks that it would be a lose, that everyone would lose. He does not even fantasize about winning a nuclear conflict. And he was questioning, like, doesn't the West understand that it's a no-win situation here, which he doesn't want to go there. But I think he is being very clear that saying he will use his doctrine of escalate to de-escalate to try and shock us into recognizing that, which of course, once you roll that dice, it's a gamble that the thing doesn't continue to blow up, that nobody could control, which is why we should do the next thing you said in your 2022 piece, is to negotiate. What you specifically wrote is that there is no peaceful resolution to this conflict that America doesn't at least have a hand in negotiating, and we should be leading that effort. Instead, we've been deferring to the Ukrainians and their maximalist demands, upping the sanctions on Russia as Putin ups his rhetoric against the West. And I guess this reinforces what you had just said a second ago, in that we have to negotiate. You can't just issue demands and continue going down a military path that doesn't even have the possibility of talking.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with the way that the terms of the discourse were set up is that we just refuse to recognize that Russia sees this war as existential. It keeps being portrayed as a bid by Putin to win a little bit of extra territory. He's sort of portrayed as just this like thief who's going to take whatever we allow him to get. And so what we need to do is to give him a slap on the wrist, and then surely he'll retreat back into Russia and give up his winnings. This is not what's going on here. I mean, what Putin and the Russians are concerned about is the fact that the U.S. Would like to set up troops, weapons, and bases directly on their most vulnerable border. I mean, that was the American plan, was to bring Ukraine into NATO. And in fact, they were very deeply down the path of implementing that plan. We had that story in the New York Times talking about how the CIA had set up a dozen different bases on Russia's border, and they were monitoring Russian communications, and they were identifying Russian targets, and they were training Ukrainian assassination squads. I mean, if Russia had done this on America's border, we would clearly see that as a provocation. But we just refuse to see that we have created a security threat for Russia. We just keep wanting to interpret this as a bid for territory, when in fact, again, what Russia really cares about is this threat to their security.
Yeah, and what's really ironic, one of the other things you mentioned in this 2022 piece is that Biden's boss, the previous president Obama, had a different view and a different take on this very issue in 2014. And when I actually referenced what you had written in there, and there was this Obama doctrine that was, I think this was published in the Atlantic in 2016,
Yeah.
which had some interesting comments in here. The article says that Obama's theory here is simple. Ukraine is a core Russian interest, but not an American one. So Russia will always be able to maintain escalatory dominance there. The fact that Ukraine, which is a non-NATO country, is going to be vulnerable to military domination by Russia no matter what we do, he said. I asked Obama whether his position on Ukraine was realistic or fatalistic. It's realistic, he said. And then this was the key part. Obama said, now, if somebody in this town that would claim that we would consider going to war with Russia over Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, they should speak up and be very clear about it, obviously meaning that he wouldn't. The idea is that talking tough or engaging in some military that is tangential to that particular area is somehow going to influence his decision-making of Russia or China is contrary to all the evidence that we have seen over the last 50 years. So in a sense, Obama just said the same thing that you just mentioned here a second ago, is that this idea that you're just going to, cause some military pain and Russia is just going to back down because it's their core interest and it's tangential to us. Why can't the current president do the same thing that his boss did?
Right. I mean, look, we're in a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis here. I mean, the situation is highly analogous in the same way that the U.S. strongly reacted to the Soviet Union trying to put nuclear weapons in Cuba right off our shore. The Russians have reacted strongly to American attempts to put, again, troops under a NATO flag, weapons and bases on their most vulnerable border. And the neocons have this delusional fantasy that they're going to kick the Russians out of Sevastopol, their big naval base in the Black Sea, and turn the Black Sea into a NATO lake. And they've said as much in their papers. This is what they've been angling for. This is what Ben Hodges has been obsessing over since, for a decade.
Right.
And and then at the same, so this is the security threat that the Russians are worried about, and they consider it to be absolutely existential, and they're not going to stop until they've basically quelled that threat.
And here's Obama actually speaking for himself here. This is in the beginning when the Crimea had been taken by Russians, and given the opportunity to escalate, to make things worse, watch what Obama did.
We saw this international unity again over the weekend when Russia stood alone in the UN Security Council defending its actions in Crimea. And as I told President Putin yesterday, the referendum in Crimea was a clear violation of Ukrainian constitutions and international law. Now, I believe there's still a path to resolve this situation diplomatically in a way that addresses the interests of both Russia and Ukraine. That includes Russia pulling its forces in Crimea back to their bases, supporting the deployment of additional international monitors in Ukraine, and engaging in dialogue with the Ukrainian government, which has indicated its openness to pursuing constitutional reform as they move forward towards elections this spring.
So first of all, he was talking to Putin, talked to him just the day before. And second of all, he's focused on win-win negotiations to try and diffuse the situation, not ramp it up. And that is like completely absent in Biden today. And I just wish that some of his supporters from the Obama administration, from the Democratic Party, would have recognized that and said, hey, we're going down a wrong path.
Yeah, at least he was talking to Putin. But just to fill in some details there, the reason why the Russians seized Crimea was in response to the coup that we backed in Kiev, the Maidan coup in 2014. And apparently there was a phone call between Obama and Putin where what Obama agreed to is that there would be that this insurrection would stand down if there would be elections later that year. And then the very next day, Yanukovych was run out of Kiev. And so I think Putin considered that to be a betrayal. At least that's what I've read. And then in response to that, he seized Crimea because he didn't feel like he felt like his interests there were exposed. They've got that huge naval base at Sevastopol. So that's how that whole situation broke out. And of course, when it's reported in the press, they only talk about Putin taking Crimea. They never explained what triggered that. The other point, which I think is important, is that if you look at polling in Crimea before the annexation by Russia or after it, you'd see that 80, 85% of the people living there want to be part of Russia. They're basically ethnic Russians. And so there was a referendum there. And even if you think it was a sham, it's still been verified by Western polling that the people there would overwhelmingly choose to be part of Russia rather than Ukraine. So everything we've been doing there has actually been not in the interest of democracy. It's actually been fighting democracy, fighting the will of the people in order to advance America's this putative security interest that we've asserted over Crimea. You see something very similar in the Donbass. Something like 60% plus of the people in the Donbass would choose to be part of Russia instead of Ukraine, if that's what the choice came down to. And yet we keep asserting that we're on the side of democracy. Actually, we've been arming ultra-nationalists in Kiev to try and take back territory in Crimea and the Donbass and in eastern Ukraine, where the people there, by a large majority, would rather be part of Russia. So whatever we're doing there, it is not advancing the principle of self-determination.
Well, and then that kind of winds us back into your current decision to back Trump. And when compared with Trump or the current administration, instead of trying to negotiate anything, here's what Biden is saying we should do now.
Let me ask you about what Vladimir Putin said last night about this authorization of American weapons inside Russia. He said the supply of high-precision weapons to Ukraine for strikes on Russian territory is direct participation in this war. He went on to say that this is the way to serious problems, and again talked about Russia's nuclear capabilities. Does that concern you?
I've known him for over 40 years. He's concerned me for 40 years. He's not a decent man. He's a dictator, and he's struggling to make sure he holds this country together while still keeping this assault going. We're not talking about giving them weapons to strike Moscow, to strike the Kremlin, to strike just across the border where they're receiving significant fire from conventional weapons used by the Russians to go into Ukraine to kill the Ukrainians.
So instead of even considering, even contemplating any kind of negotiations to try diplomatically to try to resolve this, to get it over with and to get the war ended, this just now then we're going in militarily, I can tell you, just to allow even what he said there to fire onto the Russian side of the border is not going to change the outcome at all, not even tactically, much less strategically. But it does have a chance to ramp things up and to escalate, to cause Putin maybe to act on his previous threat, which is to arm some of our enemies elsewhere in the world that can actually hit our assets there too. Now, I'm wondering if during this press conference, the meeting that you had with Trump there, if he said anything about what he would do if he wins in regards to this, because I actually, before we came on the air today, I actually spoke with one of the senior advisors on foreign policy on his campaign, who said that probably if he wins, as far as they're aware, Trump would look to get the war negotiated settlement as soon as possible and definitely would not continue on with Biden's path. Do you have any knowledge about that?
Well, Trump has said several things publicly. The first is that in that famous town hall he did with Caitlin Clark, I think from CNN, where she tried to pin him down in terms of, well, are you on Putin's side or are you on Ukraine's side? And he said that I'm on the side of, not wanting people to keep dying. And he said, a number of times that he could end the war in 24 hours. He'd basically seek a negotiated settlement. He's also talked quite a bit about burden sharing. He fundamentally thinks that Europe should be paying more for NATO, should be fundamentally paying for its own defense, and that with respect to the Ukraine war, that the Europeans should be paying for it. Now, that's not as clear a statement that we should just get out of it completely, but it does indicate that this war is not a priority for him, right? I mean, this is not something that he feels tremendously compelled for America to pay for. So I think those are all positive statements. I think it's pretty clear that President Trump in a second term would never get the U.S. involved in terms of putting boots on the ground or something like that. Why would he do that? He just doesn't seem passionate about this in the same way that Biden does. Whereas Biden probably this is the most, if you look at his entire career, this is the cause that he seems to have cared the most about throughout his entire career. Back when he was vice president under
Yeah.
Obama, Ukraine was part of his portfolio. He gave the go ahead for the coup in 2014. He's had business ties there. His son Hunter was put on the board of that energy company, and now he's made this really the central, I guess, achievement of his entire administration has been trying to win this proxy war against Russia. You also heard in that clip that he's got a deep personal animosity towards Vladimir Putin. I don't know how he could have known him for 40 years. That would imply they met in 1984. I think Putin was driving a cab back then or something. But so maybe he seems to mix up some dates. But it's clear that he's got a tremendous amount of animosity for Putin, and that was also reflected when he made that off the cuff comment in one of his speeches in Europe that we can't allow this man to remain in power.
Yeah.
So Biden seems hell bent on continuing this proxy war, not allowing the Ukrainians to lose, and furthermore seeking regime change in Russia. That seems to be what he's dedicated to. And every time that there's been an escalation or proposed escalation that he initially opposed, he's eventually acquiesced to that. So, he initially said that we wouldn't give Abrams tanks. We gave the tanks. He said we wouldn't give F-16s. We did. He said we wouldn't give the long-range missiles, the ATACMS, and we did. He said that we wouldn't allow strikes on Russian soil. Now he's given permission for that, which has brought us to the brink of something terrible. There's really only one more escalation to go, which is NATO boots on the ground. And you hear from people like Emmanuel Macron that this is exactly the situation they're spoiling for. We have a number of European leaders who want NATO boots on the ground. And in fact, there's contradictory reports that there may already be French boots on the ground there. I just have no confidence that in a second term that Biden wouldn't acquiesce to that scenario. I think that he would give into the pressure from our European allies. And I think that once he doesn't face the voters anymore, he can do whatever is in his heart of hearts. And I think that is basically potentially putting American boots on the ground, or certainly NATO boots on the ground.
Yeah, and risking all the war that goes along with it.
Yeah,
I
certainly don't see him de-escalating this conflict.
Well, I mean, clearly he's definitely not going to do it. I mean, there's no evidence that he's going to do anything besides continue on, as you said, to ramping up his escalation. Do you think that there are more people that maybe going to be following on the path that you did electorally and saying, hey, if he keeps going down this, he's going to actually bleed support, which might actually cost him in the election? Meaning, is there any risk that if enough people start following in your path here, that he could change his policies and not go down the escalatory as we get closer to November 5th?
Well, I wish as many people in the electorate cared about this issue as much as you and I do. I just don't know if that's the case, because again, the mainstream media just doesn't pay any attention to this. I think that, however, if there is a collapse in Ukraine over the next 5 months, then that will redound to Trump's benefit. The signature policy of the Biden administration will have failed. I don't know if that's going to happen, but the Ukrainians seem to be in worse and worse shape on the battlefield. So things are not trending in the right direction.
Yeah, we actually had Colonel Doug McGregor on earlier this afternoon, who says, based on some of the things that he's seeing and some of the reports coming out, that there's a large contingent of Russian forces that have not yet been engaged, that they could potentially have a large-scale operation in the relative near term that could punch a hole through something. But it remains to be seen whether that's going to happen, because as he said, and as I've thought that was going to happen before, and it still hasn't. But without question, the Ukraine side continues to get more brittle by the day.
Yeah, and I think that the Biden administration just cannot send American troops or NATO troops to rescue the situation for the Ukrainians before November 5th. I just think that would be too unpopular, and it would draw too much unwanted attention to the fact that the Ukrainians are very badly losing this war and that Biden's policy has been a disaster. So I think they are limited by the accountability of the next election in terms of what they can do. But my great concern is that once that accountability moment has passed, after November 5th, if Biden wins a second term, he's basically free to do whatever he wants, and he's not going to face the voters again. And I think there is an unacceptably high risk that he would choose to escalate the war in a way that could bring us into direct conflict with Russia.
Right. Yeah. And that's really the biggest issue here. And
I'm very confident. I'm very confident that Trump would not do that. So even though, some of his statements, they've been a little bit unclear, but I think that on the whole, I don't see Trump escalating this war in that way. And that alone, I mean, just reducing the risk of World War III to me is a good enough reason to vote for Trump.
It is, right. Even without the other three main issues you had on there, each of which are valid in its own right. The last thing I want to ask you about here is, ironically, an ally, at least sometimes ally of Trump, who is kind of on the wrong side of this and has been from the outset. And I just want your opinion from a business leader. Yesterday on the Face of the Nation, you had Lindsey Graham come out there and say, hey, there's a lot of mineral wealth in Ukraine that we should continue to fight there. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that he said, let's help them win the war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine. And, I keep going over and over militarily. I mean, I can paint this in as clear and stark a language as anybody would want to. There is no path to winning. I don't care how many trillions of dollars are allegedly there, how much you want to win it, you can't. So the only thing you accomplish by doing what Graham says here is to continue the risk of escalation and expanding of the war. When you hear stuff like this as a business leader, how do you respond to that?
Well, I thought this war was supposed to be about democracy, and now he's saying it's about minerals. I mean, this would be like if Dick Cheney came out and said, "Yeah, the Iraq War is really about oil." It's like, wait, this was supposed to be about something noble, not getting our hands on their rare earth minerals or something like that. But look, as a businessman, what I would say is that they don't have anything that we need. We have all the farmland we need. We have all the oil that we need. We don't need energy from them, and there are plenty of places to get these minerals, and it's just not necessary. And there's no reason we couldn't get them on the open market through trade if there was no war going on. So what he's doing here is just creating a very
great point.
Yeah, I mean, look, they were happy to trade with us before this war. Russia was a big exporter of uranium. I mean, even to Western countries, there was no issue here until the war started. So no one was sort of withholding some rare minerals that we couldn't get somewhere else. There were other places to get them, and we could even get them from Russia through trading. It was, remember, it was the U.S. and the West that imposed all those sanctions. So we were perfectly able to trade for these things until we said that we weren't going to trade with Russia anymore. So it just makes no sense, but they keep shifting the explanation and the justification for the continuation of this war because every explanation they've given until now has been completely refuted.
And how many times did you hear during the debate from really September of last year all the way up until whatever, a month or so ago when the $61 billion package was finally passed, that, hey, this is great for American business. We can make a lot of money, and most of that cash is coming right back into American businesses here. It's like, yeah, it's back to the whole warped view you were talking about earlier in your 2022 piece of, which is it? Is it for democracy or is it for cash? I mean, which is it? Because they want it to be both.
Well, the problem is for them is that the democracy narrative has just gotten harder and harder to sustain over time because the more and more of the truth has come out about this Ukrainian regime. I mean, Ukraine does not have a political culture that we would associate with the type of democracy that we have in the U.S. Zelensky has suppressed opposition political parties. He has basically canceled the media. I mean, in order to be a journalist over there, you have to get a license from the government. He's repressed the Russian Orthodox Church and priests and nuns, things like that. They imprisoned Gonzalo Lira, who was an American citizen, whose main crime was posting YouTube videos they didn't like. And he died in a Ukrainian prison when he should have been released.
All right.
This is a repressive regime. Of course, Zelensky has canceled elections now too. So whatever this is about is definitely not about democracy.
Right.
And we talked
Yeah.
about how if you want to affirm the principle of self-determination, then yeah, the Russians would leave. They would leave or they would not try to take over the western parts of Ukraine, but you would give self-determination. You'd allow the Donbass and Crimea to go with Russia, or at least to have the autonomy that was promised them under the Minsk Accords. But we had no interest in granting them that.
We didn't seem to, and we still don't. So we'll have to wait and see how things roll between now and November the 5th, and just pray that regardless of how anything pulls out, that somehow we can avoid this escalation and get this war to a negotiated end like it should have been a long time ago. Thanks very much for coming on today, David. We really appreciate it, and appreciate your time.
Yep, good to see you.
And we thank you guys for joining with us today as well. We always appreciate and value your input and your observation. We ask you to like and subscribe, and please pass this on to anyone you know, because just like we say so many times, you're getting info here, folks. This is the truth. This is information you're just not going to get on any mainstream media. So if anybody wants to know what's really happening, this is it. Pass it along to them. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.